Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. I made a promise to you guys at the beginning of 2022. I told you I was going to focus on bringing a mix of well-known and unknown cases to you because that's what you said you wanted to see, but there is another reason I want to bring unknown cases to you. I know we all agree, every victim is important, every life matters, and while we enjoy talking about cases that become very famous in the true crime world, a lot of victims are simply forgotten. I want to remember those victims and their families. It's important to me, and I know it's important to you, and we all know it's important to someone who has lost another person to violence. This is a case very close to home for me. It happened in my hometown, and at the time this beautiful young woman was murdered, my father was her bishop, her spiritual advisor in the Mormon church. It's a sad story of one of the ugliest and most gruesome small-town murders I know of. This is the story of the murder of Sharon Sant. Let's get into it. November 2nd, 1994. A deer hunter is walking in the juniper-covered foothills of Millard County, Utah, scouting for deer. He sees something unusually white sitting in the dirt up ahead of him. As he nears the object, he almost can't believe what he's seeing. It is a human skull. Now, Millard County is just north of my hometown, Cedar City, Utah. This is a very rural area. The largest town in central Utah is Richfield, and there's only 8,000 people there now, much less back when this happened. This is not a place where murders take place. It is not a place where bodies are found. It is mountains and high desert where animals outnumber the people. The deer hunter contacts police as soon as he gets home. Sheriff Ed Phillips and his team investigate the discovery and find that it is indeed a human skull, and it shows signs of serious blunt force trauma. The skull was missing the entire jawbone and had only one tooth left in its socket, but Sheriff Phillips is almost positive he knows who it belongs to. August 1st, 1985. A 19-year-old college student named Sharon Sant, attending what was then Southern Utah State College, now called Southern Utah University, goes missing. The college is located in Cedar City, Utah, where I was born and raised. And to give you a little insight into how sheltered kids were back then, I was 15 at the time, and I had no idea this event ever took place until I asked my dad to help me come up with some material from his files for this channel. When I posted on my personal Facebook that I was going to cover this case, asking for people to come forward if they had anything they wanted included, no one my age had even heard about this murder. Now, if someone goes missing from your hometown, you know about it. But it wasn't like that back then. Adults talked about adult things, and kids weren't usually brought into those conversations. I'm not saying it was better or worse than it is now. It was just different. The young woman, barely more than a kid, was named Sharon Sant, and my father spoke with her not long before she disappeared, and his interaction with him has always haunted him a bit. In the Mormon church, you grow up attending classes about religion, and not just on Sundays. You attend something called seminary when you're in high school. It's a classroom setting where you're taught about scriptures and church-approved history lessons. High school kids go before school starts, so like 7 a.m. before their regular classes, except in the state of Utah, where you are actually released for one period of the school day to attend seminary. I mean, maybe across the street, it might be in the parking lot, if that's what you want to do. The seminary building usually sits adjacent to the school. You walk over to it from the school, attend that one class, and then you return to the high school for the rest of your classes. It is called released time in Utah, and it only applies to the Mormon church. So I know there are issues with that, believe me, I know. Now, the reason I bring this up is to explain to you there is a college version of seminary, and it's called Institute. Just like I described, the Institute building sits off-site to the college campuses in Utah, or in some cases, it's on campus, and it's a class that you attend along with your regular college courses. In addition to those weekly classes, the Institute building also serves as your ward building. Mormons are divided into wards. The church building they attend services at is dictated by their ward boundaries, their actual geographical lines on a map. You don't pick the pastor that you like the most, like in other religions. You go to the church where your neighborhood is assigned to attend. So when you're in college, all of the college kids go to an institute ward. Even if they live in that hometown and their families are there, they don't normally go to church anymore with their families. They go with their fellow college students. If there are enough college students, there will sometimes be several wards in that same building. My father has served, I believe, twice as bishop at the Institute at Southern Utah University. A bishop is the head of a Mormon ward. Mormons believe their leaders are called by divine inspiration. Regional directors of the church decide who they want to call as a bishop. It's always a man, and it's always a married man who is considered very respected and also must be clean as a whistle. They are men who live very strictly by all of the Mormon rules. I remember as a kid, I once had a bishop who had a tattoo on his forearm from World War II, and that was scandalous to some people. They couldn't believe someone with a tattoo would be called to be bishop. And spoiler alert, he was my favorite bishop and one of the nicest guys on earth, because of course he was. Now, part of the duties of a Mormon bishop is to meet with members of his ward. He will call them in from time to time for a one-on-one meeting where they might discuss their lives, their problems, their spiritual issues, things of that nature. Now, I am more than aware that there is a lot of controversy surrounding these meetings because bishops in the Mormon church are not trained counselors. They can be the UPS guy or the guy that owns the local tire store, but they're often placed in the position to give out counsel. I'm not going to go into that controversy today. I'm just telling you that that's part of their job. They're not paid, by the way, either. No one in Mormonism gets paid for their church jobs until you get to the super higher ups. It's all volunteer work to meet with their ward members, to help people out when they need it, to teach their classes, to oversee meetings. It's all volunteer work. In college institutes, the number of ward members obviously shrinks substantially over the summer when most of the students return home for summer break. When this happens, they combine all of the wards at the college and they have what is called a summer ward. Well, my father was serving as the summer ward bishop in 1985. He was over the ward where all of the college kids attended for the summer. I was 15 years old at the time, and I very clearly remember every Sunday attending church without my father because he was serving as the bishop in the Institute ward at the college. Sharon Sant stayed in Cedar City for the summer, and she was part of that summer ward. Therefore, my father was her bishop for the summer. One day, Sharon came to my father and asked to meet with him. My father didn't know her well. He had seen her in their church meetings, and he knew her to be quite shy and reserved and quiet. So as they sat together in this meeting, my father was quite surprised to learn that this reserved young girl had been hitchhiking back and forth between Cedar City and central Utah when she wanted to get around because money was very tight and she simply could not afford a bus ticket, let alone her own car. My father was very unhappy to hear that she had been hitchhiking, and he told her that. Now, at this same time, my father had recently gone into private practice as a civil attorney after acting as the county attorney for 8 years. A county attorney in rural Utah is like the DA, the district attorney in larger cities. My dad was in charge of prosecuting all crimes for Iron County back then. We had a very low crime rate in comparison to most places, but there was crime and a few very serious crimes. I'm actually going to be talking about more of them on this channel. But I bring this up because being the county attorney, my father was very aware that little old Cedar City, Utah, and all of Utah might appear like the safest place on earth, but it wasn't. He told Sharon in no uncertain terms that she was never, ever to hitchhike again. Sharon told him that she had to go to Fillmore, Utah, her hometown, that weekend. And so my father told me, as he recalled this story, that he pulled some money out of petty cash and gave it to Sharon and told her to go and buy a bus ticket with the money. Now, as my father's telling me this story, my mother shot him a look, and we both know my dad paid for her bus ticket. He didn't pull money out of petty cash, but he's far too humble to ever admit that. But anyways, that weekend, Sharon did use the money for a bus ticket, and she did go to Fillmore, and then she returned safely, and all was right with the world. Until it wasn't. The weekend she disappeared, Sharon had a funeral to go to in Fillmore, which is about 100 miles north of Cedar City. So against my father's advice, and even though he told her he would always happily provide her with money for a bus ticket so she did not have to hitchhike, that's exactly what she chose to do. Sharon told her friend Cheryl Cox that she intended to go to Fillmore and attend this funeral and see some friends and family. One of Sharon's co-workers, a man named Royce Barton, saw her around 11:45 a.m. standing in a northbound on-ramp of Interstate 15 in Cedar City. That is the last time anyone in Cedar City saw Sharon Sant. She never made it to her destination in Fillmore. Now, I was unable to find any information on why this is, but Sharon was not reported missing when she didn't arrive in Fillmore. Maybe she hadn't told anyone that she was coming for sure. I don't know. But she was not reported missing until August 6th, 1985, and when she was reported missing, it was her friend, Cheryl Cox, that alerted the police. A missing persons file was opened, but police had very little to go on. What had happened to Sharon Sant? August 16th, 1985. A Utah Department of Transportation employee working near a frontage road and a northbound on-ramp of Interstate 15 near Cove Fort, Utah, noticed some strange marks leading away from the road and into the scrub trees. He had a bad feeling about those marks and he decided to follow them. He alerted some co-workers and they agreed they looked like drag marks where someone's feet had been dragged in the dirt. They followed the marks and discovered a small mound of dirt that had, quote, sticks and an oily residue coming up through the dirt to the top of the mound. And then on top of the mound, there was something that looked like a stick or a small piece of wood, but as the men looked more closely, they saw it was a partially dried piece of intestine. They didn't touch anything, they left the area, and they contacted the police. Officers of the Millard County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene very shortly after they got the call. The investigators carefully moved the dirt on the mound, kind of opening it up, and as they did so, they were horrified at what they found. There, under the small pile of dirt, they found the mutilated remains of a woman. Both of her hands and both of her feet had been cut off. She had been decapitated and her head was not with the body. Her left arm had been cut off and placed between her legs in a very vulgar fashion. I talked with some people who knew Sharon, and she was a busty gal. Well, whoever had done this to her had cut her large breasts off her body and they were gone. She had been cut open from her breastbone to her pubic bone, and her uterus and other sex organs had been removed. The police were horrified, speechless. Not only do we not have murders in this area, we definitely do not have horrific Jack the Ripper style murders in this area. These small town police had never seen anything like this. The area was cordoned off and the investigation began. Police dogs were brought in to aid the investigation, and before long, they found quite a bit of breast tissue under a bush about 40 feet from the body. The tissue had been thrown like you would skip a rock on a pond and had left 2-foot skid marks in the dirt before it came to rest under the bush. About 75 feet from the dirt mound, officers located a wood-splitting maul. The maul had a lot of dirt on it, and police later determined it had been used to dig the shallow grave. It also had traces of blood at the base of the metal head, on the wooden portion at the top of the head, and on the bottom of the handle. There wasn't enough blood left on it to determine a blood type back in 1985, and unfortunately, they were not able to retrieve any usable fingerprints from the handle of the maul. In addition to the axe-like tool, officers recovered a considerable amount of physical evidence from the crime scene, including bloodstains and hair recovered from gravel at the edge of the roadway. These drag marks, the marks that first alerted the transportation workers to the site, they were almost 200 feet long. They started at the edge of the road and ended at the grave. So this makes it seem as though the attack happened right at the road's edge. Now, I've said this is a rural area, and it is, but I-15 is a main highway running from California all the way to the Canadian border above Montana. It's always got cars on it going in both directions, but I guess, yes, there are times when there are breaks in traffic long enough to where you might not see someone for maybe a minute, but a minute tops. Along these very long drag marks, officers could see blood in the dirt. They collected that blood and found that it was type O positive. They also found blood on sagebrush branches along the drag trail and a very large pool of blood at the site that became known in reports as the mutilation site. Near this site, investigators found a piece of cardboard with blood on it, and most importantly, they found a blood-stained beer bottle. This beer bottle had 2 bloody fingerprints on it, one on the outside and one just inside the neck. Not only did officers find bloody fingerprints on that beer bottle, they found 5 Budweiser beer cans near the drag trail. They were able to lift 4 latent fingerprints from 2 of those cans. All of the evidence was taken into custody. Police were already quite sure this was the missing college student, but her identity was confirmed through medical records. Hair was taken from her hairbrush back at her apartment, and it matched hair that they found at the scene. Even without her hands and feet and her head, they knew it was Sharon. Sharon's family was notified of her horrific murder, and the hunt for the monster that did this to her was on. August 1985. Word of the gruesome and shocking discovery spread through this little area like wildfire. People in these parts are not used to hearing about murders, and the details of this particular case were spoken of only in whispers. People didn't want their kids hearing them talk about what had been done to this girl, this SUSC student, someone not much older than they were. But as we all know, talk of crime, especially in small communities, often leads to someone who knows something, and that's what happened here. A woman named Jacqueline Smith came forward. She had seen 2 men in the parking lot of the M&D Market in Parowan, Utah, which is a little tiny town about 20 miles north of Cedar City, the town where Sharon went to college. These 2 men had a woman sitting with them, sitting in between them in the cab of their flatbed pickup truck. Smith watched one man come out of the market with a 12-pack of beer. He put the beer in the back of the truck, and then he got into the driver's seat of the vehicle, and the 3 of them drove away. Jacqueline is shown a photo of Sharon Sant. She confirmed that was the woman she had seen with the 2 men. Jacqueline was able to give a description of the flatbed pickup truck. About the same time, another man came forward with additional information. Up in the mountains above Parowan and Cedar City sits a beautiful little town called Paragouna. It's where we like to go riding in the side-by-side. There's a beautiful lake there, and especially in the summer, it is just gorgeous. There are a lot of working farms and ranches in that area, and one of those ranches was owned by a man named Arnold Parkinson. Parkinson had a couple of ranch hands working for him that had disappeared, had just left the job. And they left the job on the same day that Sharon Sant went missing. One of the men was named George Wesley Hamilton. In July of 1985, Hamilton had quit working full-time on the Parkinson Ranch and had started splitting his time, working part-time at the ranch and part-time splitting wood for people in the Paragouna area. A lot of people only have wood-burning stoves or fireplaces in their homes in this very rural area. Natural gas, wasn't a thing, especially back then. And so it was very common to hire someone to come and chop cords of wood for you to prepare for winter. Well, that was very Laura Ingalls of me, but that's the way I grew up. Now, in addition to George, there was another ranch hand on the property named Robert Bott. On the morning of August 1st, 1985, the owner of the ranch could not find Hamilton or Bott anywhere on the ranch. They had up and left without any kind of notice, and they never came back to the ranch. Unfortunately, the vanished ranch hands and the sighting of Sharon in a truck with two men, those two things weren't put together at the time as having anything to do with her going missing. I mean, really, how could they be? The investigation seemed to stall. Weeks went by, and then months. January 29th, 1986. Police receive an anonymous phone call from an informant telling them that George Wesley Hamilton, one of the ranch hands who disappeared without notice, might have been involved in the murder of Sharon Sant. At this point in time, police were happy to have any kind of lead to follow, and they immediately began looking into Hamilton and then into Robert Bott after learning that the men vanished from the ranch on the same day that Sharon went missing. After a couple of weeks investigating the two men, they were both arrested and brought in for questioning. At the time of their arrest, both men were fingerprinted. George Wesley Hamilton's fingerprints match the bloody fingerprints on the beer bottle and on some of the cans of Budweiser found at the mutilation site and burial mound where Sharon Sant was so brutally disposed of. As the men are interviewed, it becomes clear to authorities these two monsters are responsible for killing, raping, and mutilating Sharon Sant that day. I told you earlier in this episode that this case has always haunted my father. There's a few reasons for that. Obviously, the first is knowing someone and being their advisor, having them murdered, doing something you warned them not to do. That is going to bother a person. And it made me sad to hear my dad say, "I've often felt guilty because maybe I wasn't as firm as I could have been in telling her not to hitchhike." It makes me sad to know he's lived with that concern. But like I told him, he did what he could. He can't blame himself. And he said, having been county attorney, I'm confident that I stressed the need to be safe at all times. He said, I've often wondered if when she realized what was going to happen to her, she reflected on our earlier conversation and how terrifying that moment must have been for her. He said, she didn't need to die that day. It makes me really sad, and it shows just how many people are affected by these terrible crimes. Of course, the victim and the victim's family, but the ripples and the echoes of these crimes touch a lot of others and leave people second-guessing themselves, even when they shouldn't. No one is responsible for a violent act except the person who commits the violence. But there is another reason this case has haunted my father, and that's what happened leading up to trial. Prosecutors go after both men. But during negotiations, they somehow shift Bott to be kind of the one who's going to tell them what happened, where Hamilton is going to go down a little harder. They feel like they need an ace in the hole against him, so they come up with a deal for Robert Bott. Now, this gets a little technical with legal terms. We all know what legal immunity is, when you grant someone the freedom from prosecution in return for their testimony. Well, they were not about to give that to Robert Bott. They knew he was involved, but there are also varying degrees of immunity. At the time, there was something called transactional immunity in Utah law. This was a type of immunity where a suspect was granted some strictly limited immunity, but it had to be very specifically written out and it had to be explained to the suspect. It's so complicated that I won't even go into it much here, but being so complicated, the police themselves didn't even fully understand it. There was some kind of a misunderstanding between the lead prosecutor and a sheriff's deputy, and Robert Bott was told on tape that he had been granted immunity, as in blanket immunity, as in you cannot be prosecuted. So it was just a major, major screw up. That was absolutely not the intention the prosecutors had, but because that's what Robert Bott was told, everything he said after that, he was immune from prosecution. This man who had admitted to raping, to killing, to mutilating this poor young woman, he could never be prosecuted for his unthinkable, disgusting crimes because of the incredible blunder that occurred during the investigation. My dad said to me, "It still upsets me that this guy got off. We knew he had done other bad things. He'd committed other crimes, but this was the worst. And he got off free because a couple guys screwed up so bad." It's just maddening and frustrating, and I'm sure the people that committed the mistake feel bad. I was able to pull some archives from the Deseret News, a paper in Salt Lake City, and I found an article entitled, "Bot Case Exposes Holes in Utah's Justice System." It goes over the fact that sheriffs in very small jurisdictions who are not accustomed to dealing with these types of serious crimes have got to be better trained and more aware of the seriousness of the words they use and the promises that they make to people in interviews. Some good change came of this blunder, which was great for the future, but unfortunately it did no good to put this piece of human garbage in prison. February 1986. George Wesley Hamilton was put on trial for the murder. Extra security was ordered for the tiny courtroom in Fillmore, Utah, and Judge Philip Eves barred the use of cameras and tape recordings from the proceedings, which is kind of a shame. Back then, that was viewed as something very sensational, but now we know it's the best way to preserve the proceedings. Judge Eves was a great guy. It was just a different time back then. During the trial, it comes out that Hamilton had demanded his ex-girlfriend lie and provide him with an alibi, which she would not do. He makes claims that his fingerprints were illegally obtained. He wasn't even in Utah at the time. You know, all the usual defenses that these guys come up with. The trial proceeds, and then it comes out that a juror has brought with them to the courthouse and shown other jurors a newspaper clipping about the case. Can people not take instructions? Can people not follow rules? It's amazing. So, yeah, guess what happens? Of course, the entire trial is thrown out and has to be started again. In September of 1989, Hamilton is put back on trial and is found guilty of the murder, rape, and mutilation of Sharon Sant. He is sentenced to 5 years to life in prison, with the final sentence being that of natural life. Members of his family cried in the courtroom as the verdict was read, and Sharon Sant's father and sister let out audible sighs of relief. The most tragic part of this case is not only that this piece of crap Robert Bott accidentally got immunity, but none of his statements ended up being used at trial because of the botched job on the immunity deal. So not only did he get off scot-free, they couldn't even use any of the information he gave them against Hamilton. It was just bad. It was really, really bad. Those of us who love true crime, we see this in small town police forces from time to time. And look, I am sure everyone involved feels bad about it. Yes, we see cases of true police corruption and abuse, but sometimes plain old mistakes are made, and all we can do is learn from them and do better in the future. Part of that is talking about the mistakes and making sure the lessons that we learn from them do not get lost. And that's just another of the many reasons I think it's important to discuss true crime cases and keep these victims and these lessons we learned from their murders alive in our memories. George Wesley Hamilton has appealed and appealed, making claims from prosecutorial misconduct to illegal taking of evidence. He's tried it all, this waste of space. But as of now, he sits right where he belongs, in a jail cell about 4 hours north of where I'm sitting right now at the Oquirrh State Prison Facility in Draper, Utah. The only way he's coming out of there is in a box, and that's just the way it should be. He took what no one has the right to take and committed unthinkable acts against an innocent human being. It looks like Robert Bott continued committing crimes as well. I couldn't even find a photo on this guy, but I did find prison records for him dating back around 1997, where he was suing the prison for not prescribing him the right glasses or something. I can't remember. It was glasses or contact lenses or something, just, you know how these guys are. And I also can't guarantee it's the same Robert Bott. I couldn't find out what exactly ended up happening to him, but I hope wherever he is, he's getting what's coming to him. My heart goes out to the family of Sharon Sant, to her friends, her classmates at SUU, and to everyone who knew her. I hope you are healing from the tragic loss of this kind, trusting, and innocent young woman. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. This was a tough one for me. I feel bad that my dad feels bad about it. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today. Like the video if you liked it, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. It helps me a lot. Stay safe and be kind to each other. And I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.